Hey, welcome back to Meet the Middle. Super excited to have Sarah Woodgate here with me today, President and CEO of Calgary Housing Corporation, which also just did an amazing rebrand, which is really awesome, and super stoked. I see you're wearing the pin. And I met Sarah you many years ago, but I've recently joined the board, and it's been a bit of a whirlwind, to be honest, to kind of understand the depths and complexities that exist in the affordable housing world. And so, Sarah, thanks so much for coming in and doing this with me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So maybe give us a bit of background about you and kind of what you've been working on, and then I'll jump into some questions.
Sure. So I'm a professional urban planner and a housing professional. I started my career in Ontario and fell in love with someone in Banff and have been in Calgary for over 20 years now. And so I've had a good, interesting journey through a planning career, as well as focusing on housing, especially in the last decade or so.
Yeah. And so let's get right into it, because I think I've been on the board for just almost a year now, and it's the world of affordable housing is so much different than the private housing market. So tell me a bit about your journey. I know you've been a part of true affordable housing for quite some time. Talk to me about kind of what you've seen over your time and how things are changing.
Sure. So I've been a part of affordable housing. It's really captured me in my career. That's a really cool thing about being an urban planner, is you can explore different areas. And I've worked in a lot of areas of urban planning. The beginning of my career in housing actually goes back to Ontario in the 1990s, late 1990s. Ontario was downloading the responsibility of affordable housing, non-market housing, to municipalities. And so the mayor, I was pretty young at the time, and the mayor appointed me of Waterloo to lead an affordable housing strategy. And so the issues back then were really focused on housing for lower income individuals and trying to have an increased supply throughout the city of low income housing. And a lot of the different techniques and policies are still similar today, but the housing need has dramatically changed since that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we were talking a little bit about this offline. The last 12 months, the last 24 months, the lens and the light has really shifted on this concept of affordable housing. Even on the private sector, municipalities, government of all level are talking about the housing crisis and the need for affordable housing. Even I was I talk about market housing can make a substantial difference, but then when you get into the layers and depths of affordable housing, the continuum is quite large, and we talk a lot about this. And so talk to me about, who CHC is serving, what you're seeing, and the need for housing.
The need is changing so fast, it's really hard to keep up because the data isn't even keeping up with the changes. When we step back and think about what's been happening more slowly over time, is that incomes have been relatively flat. The definition of affordable housing at the city, I was actually involved in the creation of that, and it's 65% of median income. And at that time, the majority of households that needed housing were earning under 65% of median income, which works out to about $65,000 a year. It's been $65,000 a year for quite a long time. And so incomes are flat, but housing prices are exponentially increasing at rates that really, I don't think anyone could contemplate in terms of the amount of income you have and how much that costs now to afford a home. And so Calgary Housing Company serves 27,000 residents, and we provide homes, units, as well as we have the opportunity to administer rent supplements for people to find a home in the private sector. And that's a program that the province offers. And so what we've seen in the last 2 years is dramatic. It's not incremental in terms of housing need. In 2021, there was about the majority of CHC residents in 2021 were planning to move out, and at about 71%. And in 2023, through our survey of residents, only 18% had an intention to move out. So the majority are planning to stay. And so they're the same people. So the question is, what's happening there? And it really is that affordability has become a significant issue. So we've been working on affordable housing, and now we're really seeing affordability change. And you need $84,000 a year income in Calgary in order to rent a house. And so this is a dramatic change over a fast period of time, and it's systemic. It isn't going to change back quickly. And what that means is we're seeing moderate income households turned into households that are under the poverty line. The new poverty line results came out from the province, and they exceed $80,000 a year, depending on your income. And there used to be a whole section of households that were within sort of that band that weren't considered low income. And so we're approaching an affordability crisis. I think it's probably here. I don't know that we have all the numbers. If you don't have a lot of capital already, we're approaching a time in which average income can't afford housing. And we've seen this in other places. We've seen this in Vancouver and Toronto. We've seen this in Australia and San Francisco and other cities around the world. And this shift has happened in about a 2-year period. And we can really see why that's happened. So housing need has dramatically changed.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that. Obviously, we're seeing that as well. And I know obviously CHC's mandate is having to change also and be versatile and adaptable and move through the changing environment. So you and I have debated this and talked a lot about this whole concept of market housing versus affordable housing. From your perspective, what role does the market housing have to play? Maybe twofolds for the question. The general market, how does it play a role in affordable housing? And then how does market housing become part of CHC's vision as you move forward?
So Canada's housing system is based on market housing since World War II, and the federal government kind of moved away from building housing post-war. It's essential that we have a strong market providing housing. It has been for many decades since World War II that about 78% of households have been well provided for by the private sector. And this means that households are able to not spend more than 30% of income on housing, and they have a choice in the market. I haven't seen the new numbers, and I suspect that that's changing quite quickly. And it's really important that as a society, we work together to figure out how the market can continue to provide the majority of housing in Canada. That's essential.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where Calgary Housing comes in is we've been providing rental housing for 40 years. A lot of people think of Calgary Housing as providing social housing, which we do. And those are legacy housing developments built post-war where people pay rent and the government subsidizes the difference of the rent that they can afford to pay with operating subsidies. For 40 years, though, CHC has also been providing market housing. And so that is mostly with capital funding, and no operating dollars is required. So 60% of the housing that we provide is actually mixed income housing. And so that plays a critical role. It provides homes to very low income households who pay $350, $450 a month rent, including utilities, up to market rent. And it's really provide a foundational role for people to flourish, for people to build a home and build some wealth and move into the private sector. So typically, up until 2 years ago, we've had about, on average, 1,500 households move out a year, which means that new families looking for affordable housing can move in. Now, in this very short period of time, we have about 700 households, and that'll probably continue to decline moving out. And that's because of lack of choice. So Calgary Housing is looking at how do we position ourselves in the housing spectrum, continuing to support current residents while also regaining that space in the market where we can provide attainable homes, bridge housing, so that people can move into private housing with choice. And so we really see a significant gap at what we had as affordable rents. Our average rents are $1,200 a month. We haven't had rent increases. We have the opportunity to own assets and operate them at that level. We really need housing from $1,200 a month to $2,400 a month in today's dollars to be able to get back to that model. And being able to provide that model is really important, especially for people looking to move to Calgary, people moving into their own household so that they can establish themselves and then move on into other housing. And so that's a huge problem that has just happened almost overnight.
Yeah, like pretty profound numbers when you think about a 50% decline of people who are now potentially staying within Calgary housing. And so talk to me about the demand that you're seeing, because with low people moving out, my intuition and obviously is telling me that you're seeing a higher demand for this type of need for housing. So what does the new applicant list look like for you folks right now?
So Calgary Housing has multiple ways that people can access housing, and one of them that is referred to a lot is the social housing waitlist. And so that is almost stagnated completely. We had about 11% of people come off of the social housing waitlist last year, which is deeply concerning. A couple of years ago, we had about 200 applications a month for households wanting to move into social housing who qualified. Now we're receiving about 600 applications a month.
A month.
And so we have about 7,000 households who are eligible for social housing and essentially waiting until a home becomes available. And so that's a very, very difficult situation. When we think about the housing continuum, though, the need is so much greater. And so we also have the rental housing that's available on Rent Faster on a first come, first served basis. And it identifies qualifications when you go on Rent Faster. Those are generally, if they become available, rented in a day.
Yeah.
And so the need is significant. Households that have never been looking for subsidized housing, people are coming to us looking for a home. And so while we help everyone that we can house, the need is so huge. It's about over 100,000 households at least would benefit from Calgary housing type of housing.
Yeah. And so I'm gonna talk a bit, but this is why I think the market, like you said, has to play a role. And I think what people often forget is like the cost for you to build affordable housing is the same cost for a developer to provide market housing. And even we are struggling to make the numbers make sense with where commodity prices, land prices, interest rates, like there's a lot that goes into that formula. And so one of the things I've been really advocating for, and you and I were talking a bit about off camera about this, is like, how do we collaboratively work together to engage the resources on the private side? Because ultimately, I don't think every developer out there needs to own and financialize housing, but they're experts at standing it up. And so how do we leverage those resources? Because when I hear you talk, all I can envision is like this need for upward mobility in the marketplace. And CHC cannot solve this problem alone. But that number of 7,000 homes, needed a year, and you only being able to free up 700, means you would have to produce an exorbitant amount of housing, even in the biggest developer's sense. And so, what do you do? Like, how do we solve this?
Definitely partnerships with the private sector and all levels of government are extremely important to solve the housing crisis. And I think when we look at Calgary, there is a lot of opportunity. Whenever I go to another city, I come back and go, you know what, we can do this. It does take concentrated effort, and it takes action as well as having strategies. However, there's a huge amount of opportunity as well.
Yeah. And this is something, obviously, I talk to you about because I'm really passionate about the idea of middle housing and gentle density and what it could mean for our residents in Calgary, our community, but also mobilizing a sector of people. I had Paul Battistella actually on the podcast, and Paul talked about how in the 80s, his family built a single infill. And then from the infill, they went and built a middle housing project. And from that middle housing project, they went on to build 1,000 homes in the city of Calgary that were predominantly ownership based. And, Batistelle is one of my favorite developers and one of the first that kind of really had this movement of infill. And so I guess, you and I talked a lot about citywide rezoning. You listen to a lot of Calgarians and their concerns. Tell me a bit about, what you heard. And then, I want to go into what middle could mean for CHC.
One of the things that I've heard is people are concerned about change. And I think what we're talking about is a really incremental approach. When we look at Calgary today, we have almost 1.7 million people in the region. And when I look at Calgary in 1950, we had 132,000 people. And so that is incredible to imagine over that short period of time, over 70 years, that the city has grown to that extent. And one of the things about Calgary Housing is we have the incredible privilege to be stewards of land of about 7,500 homes. And many of those homes were developed in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And every home has an end life. Eventually, every home, you have a piece of land and it needs to be rebuilt.
Sure.
And so when we step back and we look at the typology, the type of buildings that were built, I often think about those fourplexes, and they're often duplexes that were built throughout the 50s and 60s in neighborhoods, and how that was a first home for a lot of people moving out, creating their own household. And those are disappearing. Sometimes they were not legal basement suites, but a lot of people used that typology. And it kind of disappeared until the middle housing came to be. When we look at Calgary Housing's properties that we steward, we have a lot of singles, duplexes, triplexes. Only 22 properties out of over 200 have corridors. And so we're very different than Vancouver or Toronto in the type of buildings that were built. We have a lot of townhouses. And that's what people that are looking to move to CHC want, is ground-oriented housing. People do want towers, but I'd say predominantly it's a ground-oriented housing model. So there is significant opportunity and room for non-market housing providers to also be involved in middle housing. We have been developing. We have a project right now underway, Mount Pleasant. It is going to be 16 units. We're looking at potential for modular, and we have this idea that if you look back in time, you're talking about Batistelle, the most effective way to build housing is if we have a program approach. We need capital dollars, but our housing is operated on a break-even basis, no government funding. But they're done on a project-by-project basis. And by the time you've gone to all the orders of government and you've got a project together, the markets change, the costs have changed. And so if we were able to elevate it to have a program approach, a capital program approach with a certain number of units, we could have prototypes of housing like you described with Batistelle. Mm-hmm. We could take properties and say, for example, existing housing that is ending its life, and add middle housing, 48 units or so a year after year after year, in order to increase housing supply. And that's really incremental. It isn't all at once. This is a long-term plan. And that would provide much more in terms of housing options that are missing today in Calgary, and densify slowly. And so there's a huge opportunity for middle housing especially in Calgary in the non-market space.
Yeah, it's awesome because you're talking about the things that we talk about, like certainty, predictability, and mobilizing in a way that can make a gentle difference, but also, like you said, every home eventually has its life. And if we could find a way to create that home to make more homes that are also sensitive to the context of those neighborhoods, that in my mind, that's what we should be doing. Talk to me about the need for that housing form a little bit further. So you talked about folks who prefer that kind of walk-up style apartment. That to me, that tells me that there's a need for family housing within this portfolio. During the public hearing, you heard a lot of people say, like, this is not going to provide affordable housing. And I think it's because they looked at very specific communities that are very expensive to get into, but this policy that the city was adopting applied across the entire city. And so I guess what I'm just trying to understand is like, what percentage of the need would you say is family oriented required? And then, one thing I was curious about is like, do you know how many low density, end of life redevelopment opportunities CHC might have?
So yeah, quite a few questions there.
Yeah.
I think one of the pieces for the middle housing is that Calgary Housing is predominantly a family housing provider. So I mentioned that we have 27,000 residents. More than 50% are children.
Oh, wow.
And so we are the largest provider of non-market housing. We're the largest landlord. Where we're very unique, I think, in a lot of ways, is that we provide family housing. And so we partner with Attainable Homes, Habitat for Humanity, private builders in terms of helping support residents to move out. And predominantly, they do want to move to what would be middle housing. And so, for example, if we partner with Habitat for Humanity, half of our residents, or sometimes 100% of residents, become homeowners, working with them on the opportunity to move out. And so middle housing is a key role. It is definitely a development typology that we could use more of. And there is a very, very high demand, not only on the non-market side, but being able to bridge into market housing. I'm really excited about the opportunity for suites in Calgary as well. The other piece is traditionally our housing forms are fairly limited in Calgary, and people live a lot differently. And I was talking earlier about population change and how much the city has changed in such a short period of time. There's a strong demand for multi-generational homes too. We're working on a development in Varsity with the fire hall, and that's going to have a couple of units that we're piloting out where they're connected. And
Very
so
cool.
you could have two generations living in two separate units that become one, essentially. And so I think those are the other opportunities that middle housing offers. There's a lot more flexibility in terms of how people live and how people's housing needs changes over time while they're living there.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you for joining me. It's super cool. I love learning more, obviously excited about where Calgary Housing is going, and obviously moving into the realm of, not only just being a property steward, but moving into the development realm to meet the demand is super exciting. And I'm excited to be a part of the journey and watch your growth. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome.